All right, American federal government for this week. We are doing the chapter on civil rights. Last week we did civil liberties. Remember, civil liberties and civil rights, it's important to understand the difference between those two. Civil liberties, of course, are liberties the government should protect. They are what your book in the introduction to this refers to as negative rights. In other words, the things the government should not do. So they include, of course, much of the Bill of Rights, the freedom of speech, freedom of press, rights of the accused, and so forth. So that's civil liberties. Civil rights, we're talking about rights related to equality and rights related to different groups of people. And one of the things as you begin reading and diving into this is certainly equality is an American value that we pride ourselves in, but when you look at the history of civil rights, we have a long history of not providing civil rights to people, beginning, of course, with the very foundation of our country when people of African ancestry were referred to as only 3/5 of a human being in the Constitution. And then, of course, you had slavery and the abolition movement. The women's movement as well began in Seneca Falls, New York. It covers that. It would take a civil war before you would get ending slavery. But then that did not end inequality by any means. And in fact, you had slavery by another name, sharecropping and convict leasing and things like that had continued in some ways slavery in another way. And then you had the denial of equal protection because of Plessy versus Ferguson case and Jim Crow laws. It is only, if you think about this, it's only really been in my lifetime that you begin to see some semblance of equality for some of these minority groups. And it has been a long, difficult struggle. Now, women got the right to vote, of course, in 1919, 1920, but that did not mean equality by any means either. And same for African Americans. It'd take a civil rights movement in the 50s and 60s, which your book discusses. A couple of key big things to take into consideration. The big law that finally is going to help to bring about some equality. Even though you had the 14th Amendment, which was supposed to guarantee equal protection, it would take the Civil Rights Act of 1964. 1964 Civil Rights Act was huge because it actually was a law that had teeth and did require equal protection of the law. And then the Voting Rights Act, 1965 as well. Because before that, there was no semblance of equality whatsoever, and we're still a long way from it, but we've made great strides for sure. Women and gender discrimination, you've had, and your book talks about Title VII and Title IX. Those were two things to help guarantee equality. But they tried hard to get the Equal Rights Amendment passed in the 1970s, and they fell one state short of getting that passed. And that would have been an amendment to the Constitution to guarantee equality, gender equality. And there was a huge backlash to that, and so that did not pass. Of course, Latinos and other groups too have often been denied equality under the law. It talks a lot about immigration. Of course, you have a whole class of people. There's 12 million people in this country that are not here legally, 12 million. And so what rights do they have under the Constitution? And then it talks about the DACA program and the Dreamers. So be sure to study that because really it too is kind of a failure to provide equality for a lot of these groups, and those are discussed as well. So for each group that you have, other groups as well, the Disability Rights Act, that is the Americans with Disabilities Act, that was passed in 1990 and was to give disabled Americans public access to facilities because other than if they don't have that, they can't be a part of society. And that was a big law as well. The most recent group too, of course, has been LGBT, and if you look at their history, beginning in the late 60s and early 70s with the Stonewall riots, and then as recently as 2001 until the Texas case, just having being part of a same-sex relationship was actually criminal in this country. So that's right about the time you guys are born. That was actually criminal. And so in 2015, the Supreme Court had finally legalized same-sex marriage. A couple of things to consider as you study this is your assignment this week is I'm having you watch a video over one of these groups. So I've got videos related to each of these groups for you to watch. You pick one and watch one. Some of them you might have to have Netflix or Amazon Prime. Some of them are available free on YouTube. But the most important thing when you study civil rights is empathy. And that is the ability to put yourself in another person's position. And when you do that, I think then you better understand civil rights. And so many people have a really difficult time doing that. I think, for example, whether it's African Americans historically and today with the Black Lives Matter movement, they're not able to see and try to understand what would it be like to be a Black person and to walk in a store and be followed around. What would it be like to be pulled over and to be targeted in that way? But when you see that, you better understand it. The gay rights movement has been huge because, and it's moved so quickly because somebody in people's family has come out. And when that happens, it forces them to confront that. It forces them to see their perspective and to see their viewpoint. So that's why it's so important when you study civil rights to understand that. And the other thing about civil rights is for each of these groups, it took somebody really courageous to step forward and do something that everybody's going to just go after them. So whether it's Rosa Parks when she refuses to give up her seat there on the bus, or when it's Fred Korematsu who goes to the Supreme Court because he's forced into a Japanese internment camp in this country during World War II, or whether it's today people that are gay and they announce and say, hey, I shouldn't be discriminated against. And more recently, trans individuals. And they are under really big target now. People are just going after trans individuals. But I would challenge you, try to understand what the perspective is from their point of view. And that's not always easy, but if you do, you'll better understand it. When you know someone who is in this position, whether, again, it's to be an African American or it's to be trans, then you're less likely to be open to laws that would discriminate against them. And finally, and I'll leave you with this, in the broad history of this country, historically, you look back, and it's always those that wanted to expand rights that end up seemingly to be on the right side of history. So certainly the Nazis and white supremacists are not on the right side of history. Those that would deny women's rights are not on the right side of history. And I think we'll look back at the LGBT movement and see that years from now, that providing equality for all people is the American thing to do. You think about where LGBT rights are denied, it's in totalitarian autocratic governments. So personally, I don't want the United States to be in the same classification as Russia or Iran or Saudi Arabia. That's something else to consider as you read this chapter. So as always, email me if you have questions.